Okay. I would like to thank Josh in particular and everybody here at Hackley, especially the Todd, because I tend to get a little bit expansive with my work, and I hope I didn't get anybody way too much. So there are two books in the show. The first is a Silva, which was a study of the trees in our 27 acres of Wisconsin wood. And that was finished in 2008, but it's here because it was a real pivotal piece in my work, because from then on, all of my printing materials I've made the blocks, and pretty much all of it, not all of it, most of it is coming out of my woods too. And what that did, it really moved me in a whole different way of looking at wood, because all of a sudden knots and cracks and bark and decay and wormholes and all these things that happen to wood became part of what I was interested in. And the second book is American Crow, and that's my account of that first year of quarantine when the pandemic first started. And that's here because I was just finishing that up when the fellowship began. And that's actually printed on a 20-gram Gampi paper, which was kind of a new paper for me. And it's really translucent. And I really liked how I could see the next page and the next page after that before I turned the page. And so I thought when I started printing here, I'd use a Gampi paper. But I bought all the 20-gram Gampi that Hiromi in San Francisco had. And so I had to go with 15-gram, which was even lighter and more translucent than that was. And so that's what I ended up printing these on. And I needed something in rolls because they were so big. But one interesting thing right away I noticed about that is that the paper's so thin that the image reads equally well from the front and the back, which made me started thinking more in a three-dimensional kind of way. And our 27 acres in Wisconsin, I lived and worked there for 25 years, and then I left for 5 years. And when I came back, the 4 cherry trees, which I planted well over 1,000 trees in those 25 years, but they were the first 4, and they died while I was gone. And I have a tractor, and so I pulled them out of the ground, roots and all, and thought about them for about a year, just sitting under this lean-to at a woodshed. So I was thinking about my roots, and I was thinking about roots in general. And then I started thinking about the Burghers of Calais, Auguste Rodin's sculpture. And I spent a lot of time looking at that. And I was struck by how recognizable those characters were. And after a while, I almost felt like I knew those guys because they were just such distinct personalities. And so I decided to model my 6 burgers after the Burghers of Calais. And so for each one of these, I was considering one of those burgers and trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to slice that piece of wood to kind of get what I was after, decided sort of tilted towards the Burger of Calais. And some of them were really successful. A few of them went their own way, but that's okay. That's supposed to happen, I guess. And so one of the things that I bought with the fellowship money was a big wood lathe, so I could make these dowels. So they're made out of maple from another tree that fell down in our woods, and the finials are made out of the same wood that the prints were printed from. And this piece over here was printed on a foil Gampi paper. It was a little bit heavier, so it was a little easier to handle on the press. But I still was really nervous about any kind of registration with this big sheets like this. And I'm a 40-year letterpress printer, and in letterpress you have mechanical ways of registration and inking and stuff. You have a lot more control over everything. Whereas here, I felt like I had very little control, so we printed both colors at once. Barb brayered up the blue and I brayered up the red, so there wasn't a problem with registration because we printed it all at once. And it's called The Scream, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory, red and blue screaming at each other. So in the other room, So another tree that died during those 5 years I was gone was a northern red cedar tree out in the woods. I don't know how long it was dead, but cedar is pretty resistant to rot, so I went ahead and pulled it out anyway. And sure enough, the root ball was in pretty good shape. And I moved it to the woodshed and leaned it against the post. And it leaned there for roots to the sky, trunk to the ground, like they all are. And it leaned there for quite a while. And the more I looked at it, the more it was kind of like looking in a mirror, because it was about my height, about my weight. And I thought, I'm going to do a self-portrait with this. And so originally, my idea was to use basically the same formula that I used with the Silva images. I did reduction cuts. And the first color would be the color of the sapwood, kind of a light, warmer color. And then I'd cut away that. And the next color would be the heartwood. And then I'd cut away that, and the final reduction block would be the bark. And I'm thinking like that with these, using the palette from the cedar. And then one day I looked at my clenched fist, and I thought, well, where the muscle draws away from the knuckles, there's that color, and then there's the color where the blood is behind the skin. And I thought that would be a much more appropriate palette to be thinking about. So I kind of went with that. And again, registration would have been a nightmare to try and register more than one color on a sheet. So I decided to print it in 2 layers. And the front layer is the skin layer, and the back layer is the blood and muscle layer. And it's set up in front of the wall away so that you can peer around the back and see the other layer. And finally, this is life-size. It's a photograph of the base of a trunk of a 100-year-old oak tree that blew over in a storm. And I got a bunch of firewood out of it, and one nice 8-foot saw log. But what I was really interested in was as much of the base of that tree and as much of the roots as I could get. And so I spent a day with a chainsaw just working away at it. And I managed to get this big thing, and I thought it would be like a wheel, but instead it was like a big puzzle, because all the pieces, it broke up into like 8 main pieces, and then those pieces broke up into other pieces. And I think it's because a tree swaying for 100 years, it makes sense that the fibers and stuff would separate at the base of the tree. And that's one thing about being an artist as opposed to being a scientist. We don't have to prove anything to ourselves. We're totally free to speculate. But so I took all these pieces over to my neighbor who has a sawmill, and we sliced them up into 5 layers. And so what you see here, it's actually 5 layers deep of all these pieces. So it's like a 5-level puzzle. And I kept it all together. There are a few pieces I don't know where they go yet, but hopefully I can figure that out. But one interesting thing, when Jerry Saltz, he did studio visits with both Josh and I, and one of the things that he kept talking about, he liked the idea of roots sort of being like a connection to heaven. And he kept pulling out his phone, and one time he got up a picture of, was a figure from a Michelangelo painting that had horns. And I wouldn't have thought heaven and horns, but he seemed to think the horns represented like an antenna to God. And so I've been really kind of going with that idea, and I really kind of like it. So, but this is kind of where I'm going next with the roots. And then I've got like an 8-foot long black walnut trunk with the roots on that has been sliced up. So I'll be dealing with roots for a while yet, but that's where I'm at now. We'll see where it goes.
Thanks, Gaylord.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, well, thank you, Josh, for all your work and support for this residency, and of course, everybody at High Point. I guess since we're in here, I'll talk just a little bit. Right when the residency, like right when I found out that I received, the fellowship, I was getting ready to go to the Grand Tetons to do a residency there. And this work came out of that. So this is kind of the first piece for the residency. And there's this crazy guy that he calls himself Tree Fighter, but he goes around and skis and treats white bark pines and is trying to promote awareness about the plight of the white bark pines, which is a keystone species in the Rockies that's being attacked by blister rust and beetles, and the warming climate's kind of propelling that forward. Anyways, this I was thinking at the beginning of this residency, I want to do things that are a little bit out of my comfort zone, and in some ways I did that, and otherwise I fell back to my comforts. But you know, that's kind of how things go. But this one was, the color in this is screen print, and I've got woodcut, which is pretty much my comfort zone. I do a lot of colored woodcuts, and then the background is woodcut as well. And if you notice, like the screen print caused the paper to do all this weird warpy stuff, so you know I struggled with that. And then since we're in here too, this piece on this wall is the last piece, the second to last piece of the residency. And I really wanted to make a big panoramic woodcut. And it was August, and I finally had like a little bit of time where I could go do something. So I went out to California, and I had a couple reservoirs that I wanted to visit that were in really arid places. And so this is a combination of Lake Oroville outside of Sacramento in the foothills, and then also Shasta Lake, which is a little bit higher up into the mountains, both big reservoirs in California. And I went like during the height of the drought. At Lake Oroville, they were cleaning up after this fire from last year, the North Complex fire. And so I got to see like these landscapes where there's these big houses that had been burned up, and you know, just charred trees everywhere. And then it was also the severe drought, like the water level was like 80 feet below, you know, what it normally would be. And then there was smoke and haze from the fires that year. So so I wanted to create this big epic landscape that had a lot of sadness to it, but also some beauty, and you know, highlight water as kind of a jewel-like resource that we need to, you know, put on a pedestal more and more. And I guess that takes me to, you know, most of my work is, it's intimate research, me experiencing real places, and then kind of building my own narrative surrounding those places to promote awareness, to create emotional impact in the viewers, you know, to kind of deal with what's going on. So I think, yeah, I think there's always this sense of optimism in me, but there's always this sense of like a dark cloud hanging over everything. You know, you go to these beautiful places and you have these intimate connections with the land, but then you think about what has already been lost and how that might be lost soon. And so I'm always kind of navigating those two parallel forces. This one over here is another, that's 100% screen print, which again is really kind of out of my comfort zone. I teach a lot of screen printing, so I've solved a lot of other people's problems. But I don't know, I'm pretty excited about it. I've kind of built a screen printing setup in my studio that the McKnight support helped me with. And so there's one other screen print in the show, so we'll see what happens in that realm. But I do want to go into the other room and talk about a couple pieces in there. So this alcove, this is all Minnesota stuff. I kind of wanted to focus on this piece, and in general, just my fascination, interest in beavers and like the good that they do for our environment. I wrote a little beaver poem. But you know, I was talking about how it's important for me to go to actual places and the intimacy of the personal relationship to that place. This is my newest piece, and I actually gathered all these beaver kibble sticks. So they get these willow branches, they eat the bark off, and then these just kind of float up on the side of the water. I live right by the Minnesota River. There's tons of beavers along there, and so I can gather these. But I really like bringing that like outside experience of me like being interested in, you know, what I'm going to make into the actual work. So I do see myself pushing in this direction a little bit more too. But the beaver poem, it's not very good, but it talks about some of the concepts that are important to me. Wetlands, beaver dams, beaver hats in the past. Keeping fresh water on the land is a good plan for the climate. This image was generated from a combination of experiences exploring wetland beaver habitat along the Minnesota River and the Superior Hiking Trail while reading about beavers and their North American story. With vast populations, likely over 100 million before Euro-American settlement, to near extinction around 1900, to around 6 to 12 million today. These complex rodents have been revered in indigenous creation stories, killed in mass for their hat-producing pelts, and recently reintroduced into depleted landscapes to restore wetlands, slow erosion, irrigate crops, and rebuild habitat for numerous species, from songbird to trout. So that's kind of what this piece is about. I also, I'll try to be kind of quick, but this wood grain is like this kind of exaggerated oak grain, which to me is kind of like this faux veneer. I think we bring a lot of natural veneers into our lives, and that's kind of our way to interact with nature in a kind of surface level. And so that's meant to talk about that. Whereas the beaver is like this nature god, and it's kind of dealing with this veneer that we bring to it. This piece on this wall, I was thinking about that for this too. So this one's called Sky Lodge, and the symmetry of it, the focal point of the Beaver Lodge, again, it's supposed to have this kind of spiritual quality to it. But the green water, I think it's kind of strikingly attractive, but it also references like algal blooms and the landscape spaces that beavers are living in. And the beavers along the Minnesota River, when I go down there and check them out, you know, they're swimming around trash and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I could go on about the beavers, but I might call it there for now because we're probably getting low on time.
Okay.
Okay, well, Josh, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I loved touring through this time and experiencing the work and learning about both of your processes. Your work is individually so distinct, but you both really deeply engage with trees and forests. And, you know, Gaylord in your book, Silva, catalogs trees in the acreage in Wisconsin and includes prints of the long and short end of the wood and those reference blocks on the cover. And Josh, your work on the ancient bristlecone pines, you know, 5,000 years old, and the white bark pines, which are being impacted by the white pine blister rust and the mountain bark beetle. I just wondered if you could talk about how this engagement with trees came to be and what kind of questions they pose for you.
All right, go ahead. Think about this for a minute.
Yeah. So right before I started this, I went up to see some little remnant grows of old growth white pine up north. And, you know, there's a few amazing little spots, but you get there and you're like blown away by these 400, 500-year-old trees. And then you read about how that was the entire northern part of the state. And so like seeing this little pocket, again, it's this like that beautiful moment, but then you feel the loss. And so like, I don't know, I guess thinking about that, and then in Indiana where I'm from, this one family kept a bit of old growth hardwood forest in Indiana. I don't know why they did it. They actually owned a sawmill, but every generation of this family did not cut down these trees, and it's now a preserve. And again, it's like you go in there, it's amazing, and then it's just farmland everywhere else, and no other pockets of tree. And the trees grow in different ways in that kind of situation. So, yeah, I think thinking about those two experiences have really impacted my relationship to, you know, thinking about trees, like a sense of majesty and also loss, and you know, and just thinking about, you know, Euro-Americans spreading across the country, and just like, you know, all the disasters in the wake of that. I think about that a lot.
My turn? Should I go ahead? Okay. I grew up in the Red River Valley of North Dakota. Flat as the floor in this room, and the only trees we had were shelter belts that were planted, I'm not sure when, somewhere in the middle of the 20th century. So I didn't have hardly any trees growing up. And when I bought this property out in Wisconsin, originally there were 20 acres of woods and 7 acres of field. And first I bought 1,000 hard maple whips, early on. I probably planted 20 or 30 fruit trees, probably 500 pine trees. Like there was a program through the county where you could get them really cheap. So I was planting all those, turning all 27 acres into woods. And my neighbor, Joe Yedlin, who grew up there as a farmer, we were having a conversation one day and said, you know, my grandfather and his generation, they pulled all these trees out so that they could make these fields. So it's kind of, you know, for me to come in and be planting all these trees is sort of another way. But I'm not a farmer, so I have a whole different perspective. So, but I just love the woods and the 27 acres, and you know, they're pretty much all to myself. You know, rarely does anybody else have a so it's a very intimate place.
Thank you. So in a recent essay by Michael Bazzett, he writes about narrative as being one of the most powerful technologies ever invented. And he says, if we wanted to reimagine the world, a potent first step would be delving into the stories we have. And so I guess another question would be, how do you create narrative in your work if you do? And how in particular do you mark the passage of time, either in ecological processes or in the development of some kind of plot, if you do think of yourself as telling a story?
Oh, it's up to you. I mean,
You can go. You go.
Okay, narrative. One of my mentors, I had two mentors early on, and Philip Gallo was one of them. He's a concrete poet, studied at Iowa, really interesting guy. But he was really into found text. And the first major book I did was about the old High Bridge in St. Paul when they demolished it. And for that, I found newspaper articles that were written while they were constructing it, and that became the text. And the images were just sort of like, almost like frames from a film, from a walk around the bridge and under it the day it was demolished, and they alternated through the book. So it was almost, the flow of the book has always been really important to me. I did a book called Lac de Pleur, which was 7 years spent on Lake Pepin, just reading and seeing what I'd see. And for a text there, I started with Louis Hennepin, who was the first European to enter the lake. And I got Patrick Coleman at the Historical Society. He told me the story about when Hennepin entered the lake. The Native American people there captured them, and the men cried all night long, according to Hennepin, because they wanted to kill him so badly, but they weren't allowed to. So he named it Lac de Pleur, Lake of Tears. And I kind of did, I sound like I wasn't so sure about it, but I read his journal, and sure enough, there it was. And so starting with Hennepin, I found each European explorer after him that went through the lake, and all of them kept journals. And so I was able to find their passage through that very piece of water that I was spending 7 years in. And so I put all those together, and so that became the heart of the text. There's always a narrative. I did another book where I collaborated with an entomologist to study mayflies, and we corresponded for 2 years. And I'd send him the mayfly, he'd send me back the entomology, and the entomology became the text. People I'm kind of known for color wood engraving. People always, I remember early on especially, they say, well, what are you going to use for a text? And I just never worried about it because it's everything.
Could you just talk a little bit about the COVID book, which I got to see in an earlier visit, but I don't know if these people have gotten to see like how you're progressing through that year in that book, which I thought was really fascinating.
Well, that book, I was in New York that first week of March in 2020 when it first bloomed out there. And I had just moved my print shop back out to Wisconsin before I went out there. And so I came back, my print shop was in Wisconsin. I decided this is where I'm going to spend most of my time. And the snow was melting, it's March, and there was a dead crow, or no, it was a crow feather, just at the edge of the snow. And those particular woods are called Glenn's woods, and Glenn died years ago. but I still know it as Glenn's Woods. So the idea was, well, we die twice, really, once when we die physically and once when no one remembers us. But as long as I remember Glenn, those are Glenn's Woods. So that kind of started a series of just meditations on death. And then George Floyd was killed, and then you have January 6th, you have the orange pox in the White House. All these things. I mean, that was the craziest year ever. I mean, it was just nuts. But so I was just basically, I bought the paper, and as the events happened, I just continually filled the book. Journalism, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, thinking about narrative. I mean, I've always thought about narrative in the work that I make. I'm traveling to places and I'm usually making work about real places. A lot of times I think of a lot of the work as like fantastic realities. Like I'm going to a place, observing that environment, and then I'm exaggerating aspects of it, but they're all real things. And I bring them together to, push a message. But everywhere I go, there's a past to that place, there's the present, and then there's, what the future might be like. So I'm always thinking about those things. And so that's always just been really important to me. So like, I guess history is where the narrative kind of comes into my work, doing some research about the places that I go to. And that kind of propels the ideas that I'm thinking about and what I decide to kind of present to the viewer, to exaggerate for effect, to build upon. So yeah, I mean, it's just kind of inherent in what I do. But I love that idea of how story, the power of the story to like create impact. Because that's a good question. How do we make stuff that actually does something? I'm always questioning it. Is that, am I doing the right approach to that? Should I be, should I be a scientist? What should I be doing? So that's something I'm always struggling with. Like, what's the right way to do that? I think we can all only do so much, and we just have to like focus on our thing and do it really well. But I hope that narrative and the emotional impact of narrative and putting that in my prints has an effect on people. And I love how the multiple, the democratic print form or the democratic art form printmaking can kind of propel those narratives maybe a little more than another media might.
One of your works that I think captures time in such an interesting way is the white pine image, where you have sort of the historical like explosions and decimation of white pine, and then you have like this almost fantasy forest, maybe of like looking to the past and looking to the future over it.
Totally.
And so how did you come up with that idea of a way to sort of gesture at both time periods?
Yeah, so that the print that you see in the foreground there, that's actually a diptych. So in the background is the kind of log jam where they're being blown up by dynamite. But the foreground is based on old growth white pines from 4 different spots in northern Minnesota. So they're literally drawings of specific trees that survive for whatever reason. And then I built them into a landscape that has young trees below. So it's kind of like this nursery of this old growth white pine forest where everything's happening the way it should. And of course now, if you go up north, like the young white pines have cages around them because the deer populations have exploded. The ecosystem's completely different than it used to be up there. And it's just a different dynamic. So that piece is about what it may have been like before. And then the other side is, of course, all those trees that were cut down being put into rivers to go to the mill. And it's just such an excessive amount of wood put into those rivers in such a short amount of time. Massive log jams. You can see all these images at Minnesota Historic Society. You can go to their website and see all these log jam images where they're blowing them up with dynamite. It's just excess. For seeing it from my point of view now, it just seems so crazy. And then it's also like, I was listening to NPR. There was Carrie Miller was doing a series in this series called Flyover, and she was doing a series about the Mississippi River and people living up and down the Mississippi River. And one of the people she had on early on was Winona LaDuke. And Carrie was asking her like how she felt about, what's her relationship to the Mississippi River. And she was like, it's where all our trees left. She's like, that's how we got our environment got destroyed. It was like a pathway for all this material to leave. And it was that had a really big impact on me too. And I thought about that when I was making that print.
And that sort of leads into my next question, which is about research. So, Gaylord, you commented and emailed to me that my survival to no small degree depends on special collections librarians, which I completely identify with. And Josh, you've done a ton of legwork for your projects, hiking off trail in Great Basin National Park to search for a certain riskable pine, or hiking on the Chilkoot Trail in Alaska to look at the way that the forest had recovered or not from the gold rush. And I wondered, how does research feed your work? And is there a specific example that comes to mind where you really plucked something out from that and built on it?
Yeah. Sometimes I research things ahead of time and I want to go to a place for a specific reason, but sometimes I'm just somewhere and I'm really noticing my environment and trying to learn as much as I can at the time and kind of reacting. Like on the Chilkoot Trail, that's a really fascinating situation. There's this mining trail that goes from Skagway, Alaska, basically, western Alaska. And then there's a 35-mile trail that goes ultimately to the headwaters of the Yukon River. And, it was a trading route for coastal First Nations people to the interior. And so it had been there for a long time. And then the gold rush, the Klondike gold rush happened at the turn of the century. And, something like 20,000 people. No, it was more like 100,000 people came. And they traveled this trail. And then at the end, they cut down forests to build boats. And then they had another 500 miles to go down the Yukon River to the gold fields in what's now Dawson City, and what's called the Klondike River. The Klondike Gold Rush is like the way you've heard it described. But in that situation, I was just hiking that trail for a residency for a couple of weeks, and it was only 35 miles, but I was out there for 2 weeks. So I was just kind of like wandering around, finding all the trash middens from the gold rush era. And then I started noticing all these stumps that were, you knew they were exactly 120 years old. And that trail goes through different ecosystems, rainforest, boreal forest, alpine landscape, and there's stumps in all these places. And so I was just thinking a lot about like the way the forest was reclaiming those stumps and the gold rush kind of ephemera in different ways. So that's just an example of me like really engaging with the place and learning from it, and then doing research after the fact and work from that residency. I made something recently that's in the show, actually, the screen print in this room. I just made recently, and I did that residency in 2018. So it's always, I never know when things are going to come back, and I'll learn more about them.
It seems usually I work on a project for about 5 years. That's the average. And it starts with an idea or a direction, and I always build a library based on whatever that is. Like when I was working on the Silva, I collected all kinds of books on silviculture, built up a whole section with that. Mayflies, I bought all kinds of fly fishing books and entomology books. And, when we were working on My Mighty Journey, I was working with a man named Ernie Whiteman, who one of his projects was growing tobacco that was more appropriate for ceremony than store-bought tobacco. So he was growing this sacred tobacco, and well, I needed something from Ernie. I didn't know what it was. This is sort of research. And I was kind of afraid to ask him about it, you know. I was uncomfortable with the whole situation. And at the end of that summer, he was out at Dream Wild Health Farm, south of St. Paul over there. And they had a ceremony, like, it's a place where Native kids can learn like healthy life ways is basically the aim out there. But so they had a ceremony for the kids at the end of the year, that year that I was kind of working with Ernie. And at the end of the ceremony, he said, "Come here," took me aside, and he gave me one of the sacred tobacco. And I said, "Can we print from this?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, "Come back and I'll give you the other 3 sacred plants." So that's what the print over there is, actually printed from the sacred plants that Ernie supplied. And I guess that's research, and that I had no idea about the whole sacred thing, ceremony thing. I mean, I learned a lot.
Thank you. What artists do you see yourself being in conversation with, pushing back against, or elaborating on, or communicating with?
I don't know. I mean, I look at folk art a lot. I don't know, just people that are making things in very sincere ways and putting themselves fully into their work. That's what gets me most excited, I guess. And I don't know, maybe you see that a little bit in the work. Yeah, I'm not really interested in like a perfect perspective of reality. Like I think filtering something through the imagination, there's like a realness to that might be more real than a photographic reality, really. So you're always seeing like flat space, dimensional space, points of view, different perspectives in the same image. I'm not that worried about everything coming together. And maybe it's just because I'm not that good at drawing. But yeah, challenges. I don't know. That's a tough one. Maybe Gail can chime in a bit.
Was the question conversation?
Yeah, just what artists do you see yourself in conversations with? I know as a writer, like sometimes I'll read something and I'll be like, "Oh, that's so great, but I want to push back against this idea," or, "Oh, that's so great, I want to work in this tradition."
So you're not talking about face-to-face?
Not talking about face-to-face conversations, just, if art making is a conversation, who are you launching off from or reaching out to?
Well, I guess I could talk about those 3 pieces in there a little bit. I mean, like I keep saying, I'm a book guy. And so this is a whole different world to me. And in the book world, at least in my work, I often move in a certain direction or have a certain hook in the piece that ties it into a bookish lineage, historical lineage, which gets my books in more collections, special collections librarians, because it fits into their collection. But the art world is not my thing. And so when I started thinking about the burgers of Calais, it was kind of in that same vein, but it's sort of tongue in cheek, all due respect. But and then the other one being the screen. I mean, whatever museum owns that painting isn't going to want my screen, but it's sort of a play on that whole idea. And then the portrait in here is Man Before a Mirror, which was sort of a play on Picasso's Girl Before a Mirror. And I've been working on the text for that right now. And one of the things I've really been working on, particularly the last 10 years, I've written poetry my whole 45-year career, but the last half a dozen years I've really concentrated on it because I'm trying to get it up to a level that at least can survive with the typography and design and the imagery. But one interesting thing lately, so I've been looking at Picasso quite a bit, and I'm working on the text for that piece right now. And so I was looking at Picasso quotes and stuff. And at one point he wrote to this guy and he said something like, I'm gonna stop painting and drawing and engraving and all this stuff. So I can concentrate on, so I can totally get myself up to singing. He wanted to be, he was into singing for a while. And he was also really into poetry at one point. And what's her name? Alice Tompkins, who was Gertrude Stein's partner. Do you know what I mean?
Alice B. Tickler.
Yeah. There was a quote from her, something like, Picasso's problem is that he listened to enough flattery that he thinks he's a poet or something like that. So yeah, I've been looking at Picasso, his writings lately, and his quotes.
Thank you. I wanted to kind of circle back to, there was a question about the narrative which I didn't ask, but I just wanted to touch on it again. You guys have both talked a little bit about speculation in different ways, or making something that's imaginative as opposed to like literally photographic realism. And Josh, you have that print at the start of the exhibit where you express like frustration or maybe sadness that humans struggle with living in the moment and working towards the future. And so I wonder, like, how do you make work that engages with the future, or another kind of speculation about the ways that things could be?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge. That quote, sometimes I try to write things, but I was trying to write this kind of like an essay, and that ended up being like kind of what it was all about, that quote. And so I was like, well, maybe I'll just take out the rest. But I wrote that when the Tongass National Forest, like this temperate rainforest, got open to prospecting and like extraction and stuff. And I was just feeling helpless. But yeah, it's like, we're in cave, this is very general, but like, we don't do a great job of like experiencing the present. But we also don't plan well for the future, and it's like and then thinking about the natural world, it's like if you go outside and like just look at what's going on, everything is like, it's like the best of all possible worlds. I think about that, like the Candide Voltaire story. Like nature is seeing every moment as like the best opportunity, no matter what we do to it, how we smash it. It's just like, okay, here we are. I'm gonna take advantage of this opportunity. So yeah, that's where that came from. But yeah, in terms of thinking about speculating about the future, I don't know. I mean, I have mixed feelings about that. It's heavy. Sometimes I'm optimistic, and sometimes I look into things in more depth and I get more and more pessimistic. So I don't know. I think it's a struggle.
Gaylord, maybe when you said speculative, you're not talking about speculating about the future. You just mentioned it a number of times.
Oh.
You said that you were kind of engaging almost in like a speculative kind of science at one point. So if you just wanted to talk about that, I thought it was a fascinating idea.
All right, so I mentioned before I did this mayflies project with the entomologist, Clark Gary, and Dr. Gary loved mayflies. He just totally loved them. And when you approach somebody like that with an interest in what they love, they get really excited. So basically, I had like a 2-year one-on-one class, entomology class with Dr. Gary. And like I said, I'd send him the insect, he'd send me back the entomology. But if he couldn't come to species for some reason, there's no way he would speculate. He wouldn't give me anything, and I needed a text, so I kept kind of badgering him to, at least send me something. And this goes on for 2 years, and at the end of those 2 years, Dr. Gary wrote something like Ephemeral inermis, which was one of the first insects he had identified for me, was no longer Ephemeral inermis. They changed the key, revised the keys, and changed the name to Ephemeral escutcheon. The point being that science is fluid like everything else, and scientists and artists do basically the same thing. We both observe the world around us and record our observations the best we can. And there's a side to science that is very dependent on thinking out of the box and trying new things and experimenting with things. So there is a real value even for an artist speculating about things, because they're going to think in a way that scientists aren't going to think, and that might lead to the truth sometimes.
Yeah, I really agree with that. You know, have you read Andrea Wolf's Invention of Nature by chance?
Oh, about Humboldt?
Yeah.
I haven't, but.
No, that's so
must be
good.
worth it.
That book's, but so he was like this Enlightenment polymath guy. But a really interesting thing about him was like, you know, he was really interested in like scientific research being impacted by the subjective experience, and how, you know, we evolved in this world too, and like our experience of things isn't necessarily scientifically biased. And that was a long time ago, and like I think that's becoming more and more, scientists are more and more receptive to that today. But that comes back to like the creative individual like perspective of an artist maybe having some kind of relevance to science. You know, Robin Wall Kimmerer is you know, she's a scientist. She's also an indigenous person, and she's also interested in like different types of knowledge. So yeah, I think about all that stuff, and I think that's really exciting. Like all the stuff that we're learning about science and trees, you know, like the communication between plants and trees, and it's like,
You know that book by the German forester? What's the name? His name starts with a V.
Secret
I don't
Life
remember
of
what that
Trees.
is.
Yes,
Yeah.
The Secret Life of Trees.
Yeah,
One of the most amazing images that I can think of that I've read lately is where he thinks this is a mossy stone on the edge of the pond there, but he realizes that it's actually part of an old stump of a tree that had been cut down many, many years ago, but it was still alive because of the other stuff in the ground that was keeping it alive, and the other trees.
yeah. I mean, plants have been here for, you know, millions of years. We've been here for like 200,000 years, and we don't know anything. And you know, we're learning more and more. I think we're in a really exciting moment of like, I don't really know, but like I feel like we're getting a lot of really interesting new like scientific information that of course native people knew beforehand. But then at the same time, it's like these forests are communicating with each other. Trees from different species are helping each other survive. And then we've cut down so many of them. It's just tragic. But
It seems like it's all, to me, it seems like it's all just sort of an ongoing evolution, you know? And, you know, these billionaires with their spaceships now to look back at the Earth. I mean, that might be a pretty important part of this evolution, as far as we know. But whatever happens, I know the 5 years that I was gone from my place in Wisconsin, I couldn't believe how fast the jungle was taking everything back. I mean, it was just aggressively growing over everything that I built all those years.
If you don't have any more,
I mean, I have more questions. Maybe I could just ask one more and then see if you guys have some questions. But I guess just to circle back to like the fellowship and the celebration and this fellowship year, I just wondered if you had a sense of what you wanted to accomplish at the start of the fellowship, you know, whether particular artwork or experimenting with a particular technique, and then like how your goals changed over the course of it, or if you made some sort of discovery that you hadn't anticipated going in.
I can go first. One thing I really wanted to do was do a lot of screen printing, and mostly because I wanted to explore emotional impacts of color more in my work. And I didn't end up doing a ton of screen printing, but I really am engaged with like pushing color in new directions for me and thinking about how that can have different impacts. So yeah, I mean, I've got that big landscape in this room, and then the beaver moon in the front room. That's kind of a collage. Both of those pieces, I'm going in both those directions, full steam, and I'm really excited about those. And I feel like this residency will help, get the ball rolling on both of those.
For me, it was access to this press right there.
Yeah.
And I've been coming in like once a week, I guess, and very humbled by this press. Like I said earlier, in letterpress, we have all sorts of mechanical control over things. So with this press, you have to make it all up, and I had no idea what I was getting into. And Josh kind of showed me the basic ropes the first time I came in. And I just kept making mistake after mistake. But now that it's all done, now I have a better feel for that press, but I'm not going to be using that press anymore. I think with these pieces that are happening now, I'm probably going to have to print them by hand with the back of a wooden spoon, because they're going to be too big for this press, for one thing. So yeah, just spending time here and learning a lot about this way of printing has been great.
Anybody else have any questions?
Can you take a question from the Zoom audience?
Yeah.
Well, hi guys, this is Hans, and my question is for Josh. And Josh, you spoke about the inner conflict between your optimism and pessimism about your subjects, the coexistence of acceleration and despair. And I'm wondering if you explore that conflict in your work, or perhaps even attempt to resolve it.
I try to. I think I try to make some work that is really trying to celebrate those personal moments of connection, like one-on-one. I'd say that the most important moments maybe of my life, or that have been when I've been alone out somewhere. And I try to make work that celebrates those moments, and then I try to make work that tells kind of a darker story. Because I think the more, I'm always thinking of ways to promote, create change, etc. And the more that people have some kind of tangible connection, whatever it is, whether it's like growing vegetables or going on a hike and looking up at the sky, I just think those are really powerful. And I think children need to have those experiences as much as possible. Our leaders need to have those experiences as much as possible. I think spiritual centers should be like earth focused a lot too. I think that could be helpful. So yeah, it's always a dichotomy. It's like seeing the destruction and also trying to find those celebration moments, because you got to be optimistic, right?
Well, every morning you wake up and the world is still relatively intact. I think it's a pretty good day.
There you go.
Gaylord, there's a question in the chat too. The person wanted to know how thick the slabs of wood were for the burgers. And if I recall, they were sliced based on our conversation about how high we could lift that cylinder. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, type high is what, 0.918 of an inch, I think, or 916, something like that. And I think we had about 1 inch of an 8 clearance here. And the only way I was going to get any registration, I built a framework so that when we put these big slabs of wood in there, I had like furniture, because I'm a letterpress guy. I had furniture I put in there so we could position it the same way each time. And there was sort of a guide for where we'd start the paper and try and feed it squarely. But so the framework was 3/4 of an inch, and that had to be below the printed surface. And the printed surface, I believe, was like 7/8. It was just under an inch by a little bit. So that's how thick they were. And one of the problems with something like that is if there's a part of that piece of wood that isn't supported, it's not going to take impression. So you have to build up underneath it somehow. And I go through a lot of Bondo out of the body filler material, because it sets up right away. You can sand it, you can saw it, you can do whatever you want. You can take your wood cutting tool and cut it. It's just really handy stuff. So one of these blocks, if you looked at the back of it, it's got pieces of wood that are encased in all this Bondo and just all this, making the blocks. Is just a huge project. It's where the action is right now.
Any questions before we wrap up from here?
Josh, one comment, based on what you said. I was wondering if you'd ever read the book, The Last Child in the Woods by Richard Luoff.
I have not.
Well, the subtitle is Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. And based on what you were talking about, I think you might enjoy it, and it's got some positive ideas.
Cool. Thank you for that.
You bet.
Well, thank you both, and thank you again, Kim, for enlightening us.
Yeah, thank you.